December 7th, 1944. Lieutenant Edward Utz crouched in a frozen Belgian ditch, watching a German Panzer IV rumble toward his position with the inevitability of death itself. His Springfield rifle felt like a child's toy against 50 tons of Krupp steel. Around him, young Amy, Rican soldiers, boys from Iowa farms and Brooklyn tenements, pressed themselves into the mud, their faces betraying the terrible mathematics of infantry versus armor. One tank could slaughter an entire platoon before anyone got close enough to attach a magnetic mine, and even then, survival odds hovered near zero. This scene played out thousands of times across the European theater, where American GIs faced a terrifying reality. German armor dominated the battlefield, and standard infantry weapons might as well have been slingshots. The vaunted Sherman tanks often arrived too late or not at all, leaving foot soldiers naked before the Nazi war machine. Battalion commanders filed desperate reports to divisional headquarters, pleading for anything that could stop a tank without requiring a suicide mission. What none of these freezing, frightened men knew was that salvation had already been invented, tested, and shipped. It waited in supply depots across France, still packed in crates marked with bureaucratic indifference. The weapon that would transform these vulnerable infantrymen into tank killers had been dismissed by skeptics as a toy rocket, a crude pipe dream that violated every principle of conventional ordnance design. Its inventor had fought not just enemy engineers but his own military's institutional inertia, procurement committees who couldn't imagine that something so simple could revolutionize warfare. The story begins not in the thunder of battle, but in the quiet creativity of peacetime America, where a self-taught engineer named Robert Hutchings Goddard had spent decades obsessing over rocket propulsion. Long before the war, Goddard had pioneered liquid fuel rockets in Worcester, Massachusetts, conducting experiments that made neighbors whisper about the Moon Man and his eccentric contraptions. His work, largely ignored by the American military establishment, would ironically inspire both Nazi V2 rocket scientists and, through a circuitous route, the weapon now gathering dust in those French warehouses. But Goddard wasn't the direct inventor of the infantry salvation. That distinction belonged to Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl, two Army officers who in 1942 faced a problem that seemed insurmountable. How could a single soldier carry enough explosive power to penetrate tank armor without being blown apart by the weapon's own backblast? Artillery shells worked because massive gun tubes absorbed recoil. Rifle grenades lacked penetrating power. Anti-tank rifles, heavy and cumbersome, barely dented modern armor. The physics appeared unforgiving. Either you carried something too heavy to be practical, or you carried something too weak to be effective. According to declassified Army Ordnance Department records held at the National Archives, Skinner and Uhl's breakthrough came during a brainstorming session at a makeshift laboratory. They realized that if you could direct the explosive force backward as well as forward, the weapon would stabilize itself, requiring no heavy mechanism to absorb recoil. The rocket principle, crude, simple, almost embarrassingly obvious once conceived, solved everything. A hollow tube, a shaped charge, a rocket motor, weight, less than 15 pounds, penetration, enough to crack open any tank the Germans fielded. The weapon would be called the bazooka, and it would change everything. 1919. While Europe still counted its dead from the Great War, Robert Goddard stood in a Massachusetts field, watching his first liquid fuel rocket cough sputter and rise precisely 41 feet before crashing into a frozen cabbage patch. Neighbors called the fire department. Nietzsche. Newspapers mocked him. The scientific establishment, dominated by men who believed rockets could never work in the vacuum of space, dismissed him as a crank. Even the Smithsonian Institution, which had funded some of his early work, grew embarrassed by the ridicule attached to his name. Yet Goddard persisted with the obsessive focus that characterizes true innovators. He understood something that eluded his critics. Newton's third law didn't care about public opinion. For every action, there was an equal and opposite reaction, and that meant a properly designed rocket motor could propel objects to velocities and distances that seemed magical to conventional engineers. Through the 1920s and 30s, Goddard filed patent after patent, developing gyroscopic stabilization systems, combustion chambers, and fuel pumps that would become foundational to all modern rocketry. The bitter irony was that while American military officials yawned through his presentations, German scientists devoured his published papers. Werner von Braun, the architect of Nazi Germany's V-2 rocket program, later acknowledged Goddard's work as inspirational. The rockets that would terrorize London in 1944 descended directly from principles Goddard had outlined in American scientific journals that his own countrymen largely ignored. American military thinking remained locked in the previous century. Artillery, rifles, bayonets, rockets were Buck Rogers nonsense. But wars have a way of forcing innovation. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Wehrmacht deployed panzer divisions with devastating effectiveness. The world watched in horror as armored columns sliced through Polish cavalry, French fortifications, and eventually Soviet defensive lines. Tank warfare had evolved into something terrifyingly efficient, and traditional infantry found themselves helpless spectators to their own slaughter. Anti-tank weapons existed. The British had their Boys rifles, the Germans their Panzerbüchse 39, but these were specialized equipment requiring dedicated troops, not something every rifleman could carry. The United States, still neutral but increasingly alarmed, began urgent studies of the European conflict. Army observers filed reports describing how German tanks had rendered infantry tactics obsolete. One particularly prescient memo from 1940, now preserved in the Army War College archives, warned that American forces would face catastrophic casualties unless infantry squads could be equipped with portable anti-tank capability. The memo specifically noted that existing anti-tank rifles were inadequate against modern armor and too cumbersome for rapid deployment. Enter Colonel Leslie Skinner, a career ordnance officer with an engineer's mindset. Skinner had been quietly experimenting with rocket-assisted projectiles since the late 1930s, following theoretical paths that occasionally intersected with Goddard's published work. Unlike Goddard, who dreamed of altitude records and eventual spaceflight, Skinner focused on practical military applications. Could a rocket motor be harnessed not for distance, but for penetration? Could you mount a shaped charge, an explosive design that focused blast energy into a narrow jet capable of piercing armor, onto a rocket, and make it controllable enough for infantry use? The shaped charge itself represented another convergence of overlooked innovation. Developed initially by American physicist Charles Munro in the 1880s and refined by Swiss scientist Henry Mohaupt in the 1930s, shaped charges could theoretically defeat any armor thickness. The challenge was delivery. Artillery shells worked, but artillery wasn't always available. You needed something a 19-year-old farm boy could carry across a Belgian field and fire at a moving tank before that tank's machine guns cut him down. Skinner needed a collaborator, someone who could translate theoretical physics into practical hardware. He found that person in Lieutenant Edward Uhl, a young officer with machine shop experience and an intuitive grasp of mechanical systems. June 1942. Lieutenant Edward Uhl stared at the pipe section on Colonel Skinner's workbench and experienced what he would later describe as a moment of perfect clarity. The two men had been wrestling with rocket weapon designs for months, producing elaborate contraptions with recoil springs, shoulder stocks, and breech mechanisms that added weight and complexity. Nothing worked quite right. Everything was either too heavy, too fragile, or too dangerous to the operator. The backblast from rocket motors could incinerate anyone standing behind the weapon, which meant you needed shields, deflectors, complicated engineering. Then Uhl saw the obvious solution everyone had missed. What if you didn't try to contain or deflect the backblast? What if you simply let it escape harmlessly out the rear of an open tube? The rocket motor's own exhaust would vent backward, balancing the forward thrust, eliminating recoil almost entirely. A hollow pipe. That was it. That was the entire mechanical system. Everything else, sights, triggers, grips, was just furniture. Skinner immediately grasped the implications. They could make these things in enormous quantities using standard plumbing pipe. Training would be minimal. Point the tube, squeeze the trigger, ensure nobody stood behind you. Maintenance? Practically zero. Cost? a fraction of conventional anti-tank weapons. The simplicity was almost offensive to traditional ordnance engineers who had spent careers designing increasingly elaborate firing mechanisms. This violated every aesthetic principle of weapons design, yet the physics were undeniable. According to accounts preserved in the Aberdeen Proving Ground archives, Uhl and Skinner assembled a working prototype within days. The tube measured 54 inches long, weighed 13 pounds, and could be operated by a single soldier. The rocket itself, a finned projectile with a shaped charge warhead, weighed 3.5 pounds. Muzzle velocity was modest by artillery standards, just 265 feet per second, but that didn't matter. The shaped charge did the real work, focusing explosive energy into a superheated jet that could penetrate 4 inches of armor plate at effective ranges. They tested it at a makeshift range, firing at a captured German tank hull. The first shot punched through the armor like it was cardboard. Observers stood in stunned silence, then erupted in excitement. They had just witnessed a fundamental shift in the infantry armor equation. A weapon that cost roughly $20 to manufacture had just destroyed equipment worth $50,000. The strategic implications cascaded outward, like ripples on a pond. Suddenly, every infantry squad could threaten enemy armor, which meant tanks would need to operate more cautiously, which meant infantry could maneuver more freely, which meant entire operational doctrines needed revision. But naming the weapon proved surprisingly difficult. Early designations included rocket launcher and anti-tank rocket gun, bureaucratic mouthfuls that soldiers would never adopt. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Bob Burns, a popular comedian of the era, played a musical instrument he'd invented from 2 gas pipes and a whiskey funnel, which he called a bazooka. When soldiers at Aberdeen saw Uhl and Skinner's tube-shaped weapon, someone cracked that it looked like Burns's bazooka. The name stuck instantly, becoming official through the democratic process of troop adoption that no procurement committee could override. Production began in summer 1942, and the first bazookas shipped to training camps that autumn. Initial reception was mixed. Some officers, veterans of World War I, couldn't believe something so crude could be effective. Training sergeants worried about backblast accidents. Rumors circulated about rockets that flew erratically or failed to detonate. The weapon seemed almost too simple, lacking the mechanical sophistication that inspired confidence in traditional military hardware. Yet frontline soldiers who actually faced German armor developed a different perspective. The bazooka represented empowerment, transforming helpless infantry into credible threats. You didn't need to wait for tank destroyers or call in artillery. You could engage armor directly immediately with equipment that fit in a foxhole. The weapon first saw combat during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942, where it proved devastatingly effective against both Italian and German tanks. November 10, 1942. Private Thomas Conlon crouched behind a shattered olive tree outside the Moroccan coastal town of Fadala, watching a French Renault R-35 tank grind toward his company's position. The political situation remained confused. Vichy French forces were technically defending against the American invasion, though many hoped the French would quickly realize the Allies were liberators, not conquerors. But confused politics didn't make French tanks any less lethal. Conlon's hands trembled as he hoisted the bazooka onto his shoulder. He'd fired the weapon exactly twice during stateside training, and both times the backblast had terrified him more than impressed him. The rocket had a disturbing tendency to wobble in flight, and instructors had told horror stories about premature detonations and misfire accidents. Now, with an actual tank bearing down on his position, all those doubts crystallized into pure fear. His loader, a lanky private from Nebraska named Jack Morrison, tapped the tube to signal the rocket was loaded. Conlon forced himself to breathe, remembering the training sequence. Sight, picture, lead the target, squeeze, don't jerk, clear backblast area. The Renault was perhaps 70 yards away now, close enough that Conlon could see rust streaks on its turret. He aimed for the hull, where armor was theoretically thinner, and pulled the trigger. The whoosh of the rocket motor shocked him even though he'd expected it. Gray smoke erupted from both ends of the tube. The rocket seemed to hesitate, hanging in the air like something uncertain of its purpose, then accelerated toward the tank in a weaving arc that looked nothing like the straight trajectory from training films. For a sickening moment, Conlon thought he'd missed entirely. Then the shaped charge struck just below the turret ring, and the Renault shuddered to a halt. Smoke poured from every hatch. The turret never rotated again. Conlon stared at the immobilized tank, unable to process what he'd just accomplished. He'd stopped an armored vehicle with a tube and a rocket. The psychological impact was profound. He was no longer helpless against mechanized warfare. That realization rippled through American units across North Africa as word spread of the bazooka's effectiveness. Tank anxiety, the paralyzing fear that gripped infantry when armor appeared, began to dissipate. But Operation Torch also revealed the weapon's limitations. The shaped charge warheads, while effective against the relatively thin armor of French Renaults and Italian M13 tanks, struggled against heavier German panzers. The 2.36-inch rocket simply lacked the penetrating power to reliably defeat frontal armor on Mark IV tanks, forcing bazooka teams to maneuver for flank shots, a dangerous proposition when enemy infantry provided security. Additionally, the rocket's low velocity and arcing trajectory made long-range shots extremely difficult. Effective range rarely exceeded 100 yards, which meant closing to knife-fight distances with enemy armor. According to after-action reports compiled by the Army Ground Forces, examined at the National Archives, American commanders in North Africa immediately requested improvements. Larger warheads, better range, more reliable ignition systems. The original bazooka, designated M1, had been revolutionary, but clearly represented first-generation technology. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground went back to their drafting tables. Meanwhile, captured bazookas fell into German hands. In one of warfare's bitter ironies, Nazi engineers, whose V-2 rocket program descended partly from Goddard's ignored research, now studied American infantry rocket technology with intense interest. They quickly recognized both the weapon's utility and its shortcomings. German ordnance designers began work on their own version, which would emerge as the Panzerschreck, a larger caliber rocket launcher that fired an 88mm rocket with significantly more penetrating power than the American original. The technology transfer worked both ways. American intelligence teams examining German tank designs noticed increasingly sophisticated armor schemes, sloped plates that deflected shaped charge jets, spaced armor that disrupted the penetrating plasma, reactive modules that absorbed blast energy. The Germans were adapting to the bazooka threat, which meant the bazooka itself would need to evolve. Warfare had entered an action-reaction cycle where each innovation spawned counter-innovations in an endless spiral. By spring 1943, production of the improved M9 bazooka began. The new version featured a redesigned ignition system that reduced misfires, better sights for improved accuracy, and a slightly more powerful rocket. More importantly, training programs expanded dramatically. Every infantry regiment received dedicated bazooka instruction, and tactics evolved to integrate the weapon into squad-level operations. The real test would come in Italy, September 9, 1943. Sergeant Frank Peregori waded through surf toward Salerno's beaches, holding his M9 bazooka above the waves like a sacred relic. Around him, the Fifth Army's assault waves struggled through withering German fire. Machine guns raked the waterline, mortars cratered the sand. Somewhere beyond the dunes, German Mark IV tanks waited in hull-down positions, their long-barreled 75mm guns able to butcher infantry companies before American armor could be offloaded from landing craft. The Salerno invasion nearly collapsed in those first 72 hours. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had anticipated the Allied landing site with frightening accuracy, positioning armored reserves within striking distance. As American troops clawed inland, German counterattacks drove them back toward the beaches repeatedly. Tank infantry teams coordinated with methodical precision, with Panthers and Mark IVs advancing behind curtains of artillery fire, while Panzer Grenadiers suppressed American positions. Peregori's bazooka team, himself and a loader named DiMaggio, no relation to the famous ball player, found themselves dug into an irrigation ditch as a German Mark IV appeared through an olive grove. The tank commander had made a tactical error, advancing slightly ahead of his infantry screen, probably assuming the Americans were too disorganized to offer coherent resistance. Peregori recognized the opportunity instantly. He signaled DiMaggio, who loaded a rocket with hands steadier than Peregori felt. The range was perhaps 60 yards, close enough to see weld seams on the tank's hull. The first rocket struck the Mark IV's track assembly, immobilizing it, but not achieving a catastrophic kill. The turret began rotating toward the muzzle flash, which meant Perigori and DiMaggio had perhaps 3 seconds before the tank's main gun obliterated their position. DiMaggio slapped another rocket into the tube without being told. Perigori aimed for the turret ring, the vulnerable junction between hull and turret, and fired. This time the shaped charge penetrated, and ammunition inside the tank cooked off in a sympathetic detonation that blew the turret completely off its mounting. That single engagement, multiplied across the beachhead, represented the bazooka's true strategic value. German armor, which had dominated European battlefields through speed and shock, now had to advance cautiously, checking every ditch and wall for lurking rocket teams. The psychological tables had turned. Tank crews, previously confident in their steel shells, now understood viscerally that death could come from any direction, delivered by weapons so cheap and simple that every American squad carried them. But Italy also exposed the bazooka's continued limitations against the newest German armor. When Tiger tanks appeared, 60-ton monsters with frontal armor exceeding 4 inches thick, standard bazooka rockets often failed to penetrate. Tiger commanders learned to angle their hulls to maximize effective armor thickness, and the Mark IX's shaped charge jet simply couldn't burn through. American infantry discovered that stopping a Tiger required near-suicidal flank attacks or concentrated fire from multiple bazookas simultaneously, neither of which could be reliably executed under combat conditions. The mountain warfare of the Italian campaign created additional challenges. The bazooka's maximum effective range of 100 yards became problematic in terrain where engagement distances often stretched to 300 or 400 yards. German tanks could sit on distant ridgelines and shell American positions with impunity, too far for bazooka teams to engage. Infantry found themselves pinned down, unable to advance, waiting for artillery or air support that sometimes never arrived. Army Ordnance Corps collected feedback from Italian veterans throughout late 1943 and early 1944. The message was consistent. Increase warhead size, extend effective range, improve penetration against heavy armor. Engineers proposed various solutions, from larger caliber rockets to entirely new weapon systems. But any significant redesign would require months of development and testing. And meanwhile, Allied forces prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history. The bazooka going to Normandy in June 1944 would be essentially the same weapon that had landed in North Africa 18 months earlier, improved in details but fundamentally unchanged. It would face German armor that had evolved significantly, incorporating sloped armor, thicker plates, and tactical doctrines specifically designed to neutralize infantry anti-tank weapons. The Panther tank, Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, featured frontal armor that standard bazooka rockets could barely scratch. The Tiger, already formidable, had been joined by the even more massive King Tiger, a 70-ton behemoth that seemed almost invulnerable to infantry weapons. Despite these limitations, the bazooka remained irreplaceable. No other portable weapon gave infantrymen comparable anti-armor capability. Bazookas couldn't guarantee stopping every German tank, but their mere presence forced enemy armor to operate more cautiously, buying time for American units to maneuver, retreat, or bring up heavier weapons. In the algebra of infantry combat, that psychological edge was priceless, the difference between paralyzed panic and determined resistance. The weapon that would storm Normandy's beaches was not perfect, but it was infinitely better than nothing. June 6, 1944. Corporal William Peterson crouched in the blood-stained surf of Omaha Beach, watching the carefully synchronized invasion plan disintegrate into chaos. Everywhere he looked, men died, cut down by machine gun fire, blown apart by artillery, drowned under the weight of their equipment. Above the screaming and explosions, Peterson could hear the distinctive crack of German 88mm guns firing from positions in the cliffs. Those guns, originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons, had proven devastatingly effective against tanks and infantry alike. Peterson's bazooka, wrapped in a rubber bag to protect it from salt water, suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate against fortified positions that had withstood naval bombardment. The landing succeeded, Barely. Through sheer numerical superiority and individual heroism rather than tactical excellence. Once American forces pushed inland from the beaches, they encountered terrain that seemed specifically designed to negate Allied advantages. The Norman bocage, ancient hedgerows growing atop earthen banks that divided tiny fields into natural fortresses, transformed the countryside into a defender's paradise. German infantry could hide in hedgerows, allowing American armor to pass, then emerge behind tanks to attack vulnerable rear armor or engage supporting infantry. Every field became a potential killing ground. This was where the bazooka found its true calling. In the close-quarters warfare of the hedgerows, engagement distances rarely exceeded 50 yards. German tanks, unable to maneuver freely in the confined lanes between fields, lost their mobility advantage. Bazooka teams learned to work in coordination with infantry squads, using suppressing fire to pin enemy troops, while rocket teams flanked armored vehicles. The tactics were crude but effective. Locate a tank, maneuver for a side or rear shot, fire multiple rockets simultaneously to overwhelm reactive armor or crew responses, then vanish before German infantry could retaliate. Technical Sergeant Jake McNeice, a Cherokee soldier from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, developed particularly effective bazooka tactics. McNeice realized that the weapon's low velocity and arcing trajectory, liabilities on open ground, became advantages in vertical terrain. His teams learned to fire rockets from elevated positions, second-story windows, hayloft doors, tree stands, down onto the thin top armor of German tanks. According to after-action reports from his regiment, McNeice's squad destroyed 7 Panzer IVs and 2 Panthers using this technique during the Normandy campaign, losses that forced German armor to avoid entire sectors his unit controlled. But the bocage fighting also demonstrated how rapidly warfare evolved. By mid-June, German tank crews had adapted their tactics, refusing to enter villages or confined spaces without extensive infantry screening. Panzer commanders learned to use high-explosive shells to demolish buildings that might conceal bazooka teams before advancing. The Wehrmacht deployed more Panzerschrecks, their 88mm response to the bazooka, which outranged and outpenetrated the American weapon, forcing bazooka teams to risk longer approaches against enemies with superior firepower. The most dangerous German armor, the Panthers and Tigers, remained problematic. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding a tank battalion in the 4th Armored Division, noted in his combat diary that bazooka-equipped infantry regularly reported successful hits on heavy German tanks that failed to achieve penetration. The rockets would strike, the shaped charge would detonate, and the tank would continue operating, its crew shaken but unharmed behind thick armor plates. These engagements devastated infantry morale. Soldiers who'd successfully closed with enemy armor, accepted enormous personal risk, and executed perfect attacks, watched their rockets bounce off with spark shower futility. American ordnance officers in Normandy sent urgent cables back to Aberdeen Proving Ground, requesting improved warheads. The response was frustrating. Next-generation rockets were in development but wouldn't reach frontline units until late 1944 at the earliest. Supply priorities favored ammunition, fuel, and replacement vehicles. Bazooka rockets, while important, competed for shipping space with thousands of other critical items. Soldiers in France would have to make do with existing weapons, supplementing bazookas with captured German Panzerschrecks when possible, and developing increasingly desperate tactics to defeat heavy armor. One such tactic, controversial and extraordinarily dangerous, involved swarming, multiple bazooka teams engaging a single tank simultaneously from different angles. The theory held that even if individual rockets failed to penetrate, the cumulative effect of multiple shaped charge jets might crack welds, jam turret rings, damage optics, or panic the crew into abandoning their vehicle. The tactic occasionally worked, but at horrific cost. German tanks didn't fight alone. They operated with infantry support, machine guns, and coordinated fire from other vehicles. Swarming attacks often ended with entire American squads annihilated. By August 1944, as Allied forces finally broke out from Normandy and began the race across France, the bazooka had proven itself indispensable despite its limitations. It couldn't stop every German tank, couldn't guarantee penetration against the heaviest armor, and required soldiers to accept terrifying risks. But it gave infantry anti-armor capability where none had existed before. And that fundamental shift, from helpless targets to credible threats, justified every compromise and limitation. The weapon's greatest test, however, still lay ahead, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, December 16, 1944. Private First Class Richard Brookins woke to thunder that made the earth heave like a living thing. For 90 minutes, German artillery pounded American positions across the Ardennes forest, a bombardment so intense that men's ears bled and concussions knocked soldiers unconscious inside their foxholes. When the barrage finally lifted, a silence fell that somehow seemed worse than the explosions. In that silence, Brookins heard the rumble of diesel engines, many engines growing steadily louder. Hitler's last great gamble in the West, later called the Battle of the Bulge, crashed into American lines with overwhelming force. 25 German divisions, including elite SS Panzer units, attacked across a 60-mile front. Their objective: split Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate on the Soviet threat in the east. Leading the assault were over 400 tanks, including Panthers, Tigers, and the new King Tigers, the most heavily armored vehicles ever deployed in combat. American forces in the Ardennes, thinly spread and considered to be in a quiet sector for rest and refitting, reeled under the attack. Units disintegrated, communication collapsed, and German armor penetrated deep into Allied rear areas. In the chaos, small groups of American soldiers found themselves isolated, surrounded, desperately trying to slow the German advance with whatever weapons they possessed. For many, that meant bazookas. At a crossroads near the Belgian village of Malmedy, a makeshift group of clerks, cooks, and stragglers organized around 3 soldiers with bazooka training. When a column of Panther tanks approached, confident in their numerical superiority and heavy armor, these ad hoc defenders scored a remarkable victory. By positioning themselves in buildings on opposite sides of the road and waiting until the Panthers entered the kill zone, they achieved devastating crossfire. The lead Panther took a rocket through its thinner side armor, blocking the road. The rear Panther received similar treatment. Trapped between burning vehicles, the middle Panthers attempted to reverse, but collided with each other in the narrow street. Over 2 hours, the American bazooka teams methodically destroyed or disabled 7 Panthers, delaying that particular German advance by an entire day. An eternity in the fluid combat of the Bulge. Such small unit actions multiplied across the Ardennes proved critical. American forces couldn't stop the German offensive, but they could slow it, buying time for reinforcements to arrive and for Eisenhower to shift reserves. Bazooka teams became speed bumps, expendable, often sacrificial, but effective at disrupting German timetables. The German plan depended on rapid advance to capture fuel supplies. Their tanks carried limited fuel, expecting to replenish from captured American depots. Every hour of delay meant more German vehicles sputtering to a halt with empty tanks. At Bastogne, the most famous engagement of the Bulge, bazooka-equipped paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division turned the surrounded town into a fortress. German armor probing Bastogne's defenses encountered bazookas firing from cellars, church towers, and foxholes so close to German lines that muzzle flashes singed panzer skirts. According to divisional records preserved at the Army Heritage Center, paratroopers at Bastogne destroyed or disabled 37 German tanks in the first week of encirclement, almost all with bazookas, a remarkable achievement given their numerical and firepower disadvantages. But the Ardennes also revealed the bazooka's limitations in winter warfare. Frozen ground made digging foxholes nearly impossible, leaving bazooka teams exposed. Snow reduced effective vision and camouflage opportunities. The extreme cold caused rocket motors to malfunction. Propellant designed for moderate temperatures burned inconsistently in sub-zero conditions, causing erratic flight and premature detonations. Soldiers discovered that rockets stored in heated areas, then suddenly exposed to freezing temperatures, could fail entirely as moisture condensed and froze internal components. Technical solutions emerged from field expedients. Soldiers learned to carry rockets inside their uniforms, using body heat to keep them warm until needed. bazooka teams began requesting additional rockets beyond standard allocations, recognizing that cold weather misfires meant they might need 5 or 6 shots to achieve what would normally require 2 or 3. Supply sergeants, themselves improvising in impossible circumstances, diverted rockets from rear area units to frontline infantry, creating temporary shortages in quiet sectors to ensure combat units remained equipped. The German Panzerschreck, which American troops increasingly captured and used, proved slightly more reliable in extreme cold, but suffered from the same fundamental challenges. Rocket propulsion technology in 1944 simply wasn't optimized for Arctic conditions, and both sides struggled with reliability issues. The difference was that German forces, on the offensive, could choose engagement conditions. American defenders had to fight wherever German armor appeared. By late December, the German offensive stalled. Fuel shortages, heroic American resistance, clearing weather that allowed Allied air superiority, and finally, relief columns breaking through to Bastogne combined to turn Hitler's gamble into a catastrophic defeat. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended with German surrender, and Allied intelligence teams fanned across the collapsed Reich, cataloging captured equipment, interrogating prisoners, and piecing together the technological story of 6 years of warfare. Among their findings, German weapons development programs that had closely studied American bazooka technology, Soviet forces equipped with their own rocket launchers based on captured examples, and Japanese anti-tank rockets clearly influenced by intelligence about the American weapon. The bazooka, the crude tube that skeptics had dismissed as a toy, had been copied by every major combatant because its fundamental insight was too powerful to ignore. Shaped charges delivered by rockets gave infantry anti-armor capability without requiring specialized equipment or extensive training. The weapon democratized tank killing, spreading that capability across entire armies rather than concentrating it in dedicated anti-tank units. Post-war analysis revealed the bazooka's strategic impact exceeded its tactical effectiveness. According to a 1947 Rand Corporation study commissioned by the Department of Defense and now declassified, German armor operations throughout Western Europe showed measurably more caution than comparable operations on the Eastern Front, where Soviet infantry initially lacked effective anti-tank rockets. German tanks in the West advanced more slowly, operated in tighter coordination with infantry, and avoided certain terrain types, all behavioral changes attributable to bazooka threat. These operational adjustments, while rational for German commanders, reduced armor's effectiveness, slowed offensive operations, and contributed to Allied operational success. The human cost calculations were sobering. American infantry casualties in anti-tank operations remained substantial despite the bazooka. Stopping a tank still required dangerous proximity and exposed soldiers to devastating return fire. Yet casualty analyses suggested that units equipped with bazookas suffered approximately 30% fewer casualties in tank encounters than comparable units without anti-tank capability, a significant statistical difference representing thousands of lives saved or injuries prevented. Robert Goddard, the rocket pioneer whose work had indirectly inspired the weapon, died in August 1945, just 3 months after Germany's surrender. He never witnessed the full flowering of rocket technology in the post-war period, the V-2 rockets captured from Germany that became the foundation for both American and Soviet space programs, the evolution of tactical rockets into guided missiles, or the eventual development of the weapon systems that would define Cold War strategic doctrine. Yet his obsessive belief that rockets represented the future of propulsion, mocked by contemporaries, ignored by military establishments, was comprehensively vindicated. Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl, the bazooka's direct inventors, received modest recognition. Both men continued working in military ordnance after the war, contributing to successive generations of anti-tank weapons. The bazooka itself underwent continuous evolution, with larger 3.5-inch warheads replacing the original 2.36-inch rockets, and eventually wire-guided missiles superseding unguided rockets entirely. But the fundamental concept, a tube-launched rocket with a shaped charge warhead, operable by infantry, remained constant. The Soviet Union developed the RPG series, rocket-propelled grenades that became ubiquitous in conflicts worldwide. These weapons, direct descendants of the bazooka concept, armed insurgencies, revolutionary movements, and conventional forces across 6 decades. American forces facing RPGs in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq confronted the evolved offspring of their own innovation, a reminder that weapons technology recognizes no permanent allegiance. Lieutenant Edward Utz, who began this story crouching in a Belgian ditch watching a Panzer IV approach, survived the war. He returned to Iowa, married his childhood sweetheart, and spent 40 years teaching high school physics. He rarely spoke about the war, but when pressed by curious students, he would describe the moment he first fired a bazooka in combat, the terror, the unlikely geometry of a shaped charge jet slicing through armor plate, and the profound psychological shift from helplessness to agency. "We went from being targets," he once told a classroom, to being participants. That transformation, giving individual soldiers the power to affect armored warfare's outcome, represented the bazooka's enduring legacy. The weapon democratized battlefield power in ways that military theorists are still analyzing decades later. Before the bazooka, anti-tank capability belonged to specialists, dedicated anti-tank gun crews with their heavy, cumbersome weapons, or tank destroyers that required logistical support and couldn't accompany infantry into every position. After the bazooka, every squad possessed the means to threaten armor, fundamentally altering the psychological contract between foot soldiers and mechanized warfare. Modern military doctrine reflects this shift. Contemporary infantry units carry descendants of the bazooka, Javelin missiles, AT-4 rockets, Carl Gustaf recoilless rifles as standard equipment, not specialized gear. The assumption that infantry must possess organic anti-armor capability has become so deeply embedded in military thinking that it's difficult to imagine warfare without it. Yet that assumption is barely 80 years old, birthed in a makeshift laboratory by 2 officers staring at a section of pipe. The economic implications proved equally profound. The bazooka cost approximately $23 to manufacture in 1944, equivalent to roughly $400 in modern currency. Compare that to a Sherman tank at $44,000, or a Panzer IV at considerably more. The cost exchange ratio favored defenders dramatically. A squad armed with bazookas costing perhaps $200 could theoretically destroy armor worth hundreds of thousands. This asymmetry influenced post-war military procurement philosophy, encouraging investment in infantry anti-tank weapons as force multipliers that provided disproportionate capability relative to cost. The technological lineage is direct and traceable. Korean War-era 3.5-inch super bazookas fired rockets with twice the penetration of the original. Vietnam-era M72 Law rockets provided disposable, single-shot capability. Modern Javelin missiles incorporate infrared guidance, top attack trajectories, and sophisticated countermeasures, but the conceptual thread connects directly back to Skinner and Uhl's hollow tube: give infantry the power to kill tanks. Yet perhaps the bazooka's most significant legacy exists in the realm of ideas rather than hardware. The weapon represented a philosophical break from incremental military innovation, the endless refinement of existing concepts that characterized much of World War II development. Instead, it embodied radical simplicity. Ignore conventional wisdom about recoil management. Embrace rather than fight the physics of rocket propulsion. Accept that crude can be effective. That willingness to reject established design paradigms in favor of first principles thinking became increasingly important as warfare accelerated technologically. Robert Hutchings Goddard's ghost haunts this story. The moon man who neighbors mocked, whose American military presentations met with bureaucratic indifference, whose foundational work on rocket propulsion was better appreciated by Nazi engineers than his own countrymen. His vindication came in forms he never anticipated. He dreamed of space exploration, of rockets carrying scientific instruments to altitudes where conventional aircraft couldn't function. Instead, his principles were weaponized, turned toward destruction rather than discovery. One wonders what Goddard would have thought, watching newsreel footage of bazookas in action across European battlefields, knowing his life's work had been transformed into instruments of war. The human stories resist tidy conclusions. Of the approximately 476,000 bazookas manufactured during World War II, each potentially saved lives by giving soldiers means to defend themselves against armor, yet each also represented violence, destruction, and the industrial mobilization of killing. The young men who carried these weapons, farm boys from Kansas, factory workers from Detroit, immigrant sons from New York tenements, became tank killers not because they sought that role, but because circumstance and necessity demanded it. Many died attempting engagements that training films made look routine, but which actual combat revealed as desperate gambles against overwhelming firepower. The statistics remain incomplete. How many German tanks fell to bazooka fire? The number exists somewhere in after-action reports and divisional records, probably between 1,500 and 3,000, though reliable accounting is impossible given battlefield confusion and overlapping kill claims. How many American soldiers died operating bazookas? Again, records provide only approximations. Tank killing was lethal work, and bazooka teams suffered disproportionate casualties relative to their numbers. What remains indisputable is that a weapon dismissed as a toy rocket by skeptics fundamentally altered infantry warfare. It gave soldiers facing armored death machines a fighting chance, transformed tactical calculations that had favored armor since the Spanish Civil War, and demonstrated that radical simplicity could sometimes defeat elaborate engineering. In an era of increasingly complex military technology, guided missiles, stealth aircraft, autonomous weapon systems, the bazooka's crude effectiveness serves as a reminder that warfare ultimately rewards solutions that work, not solutions that conform to aesthetic expectations about how military hardware should function. Lieutenant Edward Utz, teaching physics to Iowa teenagers in the 1970s, would occasionally pause mid-lecture, marker in hand, staring at equations on the blackboard. Students assumed he was gathering his thoughts. What they couldn't know was that sometimes, unexpectedly, he would remember a frozen Belgian morning, a Panzer IV grinding toward his position, and the remarkable moment when a tube and a rocket transformed terror into possibility. That memory, multiplied across thousands of soldiers, repeated in countless engagements across 3 continents, constitutes the bazooka's true legacy. Not the weapon itself, but the hope it represented that human ingenuity could level impossibly unequal contests. The inventor's toy rocket had indeed turned GIs into tank killers, but more than that, it had proven that warfare's equations could be rewritten by those willing to think differently. In the annals of military innovation, few weapons have delivered such disproportionate strategic impact from such elegant simplicity. The bazooka was never perfect, never ideal, and frequently inadequate against the heaviest German armor. But it was there, in foxholes and hedgerows, carried by ordinary soldiers who became extraordinary through necessity. And sometimes, in warfare as in life, being there, imperfect but present, makes all the difference.